Welcome to our community Bible study for Thursday, October the 28th. We're continuing to read through Genesis and talking about the life of Joseph. We're actually covering the material of about 8 chapters today, but don't worry, we're not going to read all of that. We're going to hit the important parts of the story where we talk about how Joseph, even though his brothers sold him into slavery, it turns around years later, he ends up helping to save them during a time of famine. So let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen. Amen. Well, the main ideas, and I have, I think, 5 of them, is that there is a famine that's about to overtake Egypt and most of the Middle East, including the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his family are living. His sons, after a while, are forced to go to Egypt because they are running out of food. But they do not recognize their brother Joseph, who has become the person that the Pharaoh has entrusted the rule of the land. Joseph, of course, has to decide how he's going to treat his brothers. Does he take revenge? Is he bitter? How is he going to deal with them? What we find out is that eventually Joseph does forgive them, and he wants to see his father, and Jacob's whole family moves to Egypt for protection during this time of famine. So Genesis chapter 42, Joseph's brothers go to Egypt. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, remember Jacob is the father, also named Israel, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? Stop standing around, boys." He continued, "I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." It took the father to get the boys to take action. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, who was the youngest, Joseph's brother, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. You know, Jacob is still grieving that he thinks that his son Joseph has died, and he can't stand to lose another son, especially since they are the 2 sons from Rachel, who is the love of his life. So Israel's sons, the 10 of them, were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Well, Joseph was the governor of Egypt, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw them, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. It had been at least 13, probably closer to 15 years from what I can tell, since they had seen him. Then Joseph remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you've come to see where our land is unprotected." And Joseph continues and asks questions about them and their family, and they don't understand why he's asking those, but clearly he's sorting through his loyalty to Egypt and his position and himself, and his loyalty to his family. And boy, there's a lot of emotions mixed into that. And so on the 3rd day, while they were there in Egypt, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. You know, they must have been very afraid because Egypt was, even in a time of famine, was the most powerful nation in that part of the world. Joseph was basically acting on behalf of the Pharaoh. And there was animosity between Egyptians and Hebrews. And so this family of brothers were treading carefully because they knew they needed food and they needed to do whatever this king of Egypt had to tell them to do. So, verse 21, the brothers said to one another in their own language, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Their guilt from what they had done years before was still haunting them. Reuben, who is the oldest, replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood," meaning they are paying the price for what they've done. But they did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he spoke Egyptian and was using an interpreter. Joseph turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes, so he was going to stay. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack. That was supposed to be the cost of the grain, and to give them provisions for their journey, and this was done for them. They loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. Now what happens in the meantime is the brothers on their way back discover that the money that they were supposed to give to Joseph for the grain was still in their sacks. And they thought they could never explain that. They thought that he would think they were thieves, and they were really worried. And now their brother Simeon is in a Egyptian jail. So when they get back and tell their father, Jacob feels like he's now lost 2 of his sons instead of just 1. And he refuses to allow Benjamin, the youngest, to leave. Chapter 43, the second journey. Well, the famine was still severe in the land. They were about 2 years into this famine. So when they had eaten all the grain they brought from Egypt, their father said, "Go back and buy us a little more food." But Judah, one of the brothers, said to him, the man, they don't know it's Joseph. The man warned us solemnly, "You will not see my face again unless your brother's with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we'll go down and buy food. But if you will not send him, we will not go. Because the man said to us, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.' And Jacob, known as Israel, the father, said, 'Why did you bring this trouble on me by telling the man you had another brother?'" He can't believe it. Well, what happens is they eventually convince Jacob that Benjamin has to go with them because they have to get grain or they're going to die. So they tell him about how the man in Egypt questioned them so much about things. And his brother Judah guarantees the safety of Benjamin, the youngest. Well, I don't know that Judah could guarantee that, but he convinced his father. So Jacob tells them to go. And he tells them, not only will you pay for the grain, you're going to pay double the price. And they sent also extravagant gifts along with them in order to try to stay in the favor of the man in Egypt who holds their future in his hands. So they hurried back to Egypt with these gifts and with Joseph's youngest brother, Benjamin. The brothers explain about how they still owe for the first purchase of food, and I think they're expecting they're going to be thrown into jail themselves. But they are surprised when they're invited to Joseph's house, and that is where he's going to meet with them to discuss about them getting their grain. So here we pick up the story. When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, "How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "Your servant, our father, is alive and well," and they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. As Joseph looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. Boy, after all these years, now he saw his brother. After he washed his face, he came out, controlling himself, and said, "Serve the food." This is an interesting picture. They served Joseph by himself because of his position, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians. So you see, they looked down on the Hebrews. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. I suspect they really had no understanding of what was going on and why in the world, and they wondered why in the world were they being given this treatment in the house of the number one person in Egypt. When portions of food were served to them from Joseph's table, I'm sure he was served first, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Now Joseph gave instructions to the steward of his house to fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, put their silver that they were going to purchase, their money back in the mouth of the sack, then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. And he did as Joseph said. So you see, even though Joseph was weeping and he was touched and he cared for them, he still had this somehow or other desire to want to make his brothers pay. So he's setting them up and using his authority to kind of get back at them a little bit. And can you blame him? They sold him into slavery. Verse 3, as the morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, "Go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid good for evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done.' So when the servant caught up with them, he repeated these words. But they said to him, 'Why does my Lord say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything like that.'" They're trying to plead that they're honest. "We even brought back to you from the land of Canaan the silver we found from inside the mouths of our sacks from the previous trip. So why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? And if anyone of your servants is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves." Well, they'd be careful what you say. "Very well," the servant said, "let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave. The rest of you will be free from blame." So each of them lowered their sack. They opened it. The steward searched them, beginning with the oldest to the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And at this they tore their clothes. They loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. At that point, they thought the worst possible thing could happen was that Benjamin was being accused and was going to be punished. They knew that their father Jacob would never forgive them. So, yes, indeed, Joseph accuses them of theft Judah, the brother, begs for mercy, and there's a whole description of how they go back and forth. So Joseph insists on keeping the little brother Benjamin, no matter what they say will happen to their father. Well, before they could leave, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And yet he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. All this 15 or more years of anger and grief and resentment and not knowing about his father or his brother, all of those things just had been, I'm sure, pent up inside, and they all came out. And he wept so loudly that everyone heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer them because they were terrified at his presence. He was emotional, and they were like just trying to get some food. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Now, isn't that something? Joseph not only was wanting to reconcile with his family and willing to forgive them, but he is seeing that it was God's ability to use Joseph to save his family that made what happened before unimportant, but also part of what God's plan was. So Joseph says, "For 2 years now there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there'll be no plowing or reaping." So they're just getting started in this famine. "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." So then it wasn't really you who sent me here, but God. Wow. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of this entire household, and ruler of Egypt. So from a slave, sold, he became the head of Egypt. "So now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen,'" which is there on the east part of the Nile River, "and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, all that you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still yet to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it really is I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him and weeping. He kissed his brothers and wept over all of them. And afterward his brothers talked with him. So they've got to go back and convince Jacob that the son he thought was dead is alive, and he's now the ruler of Egypt. Wow. Well, what happens is the Pharaoh learns of this story. He's generous to Joseph and his brothers. He gives them resources to go back to Canaan and bring the family to Egypt. They have, I think Joseph, of course, is on a chariot, but the rest have all the animals and carts to carry things with. Father Jacob, when he learns that Joseph is alive and well in Egypt, is revived from this grief that's been overwhelming him. So then they return to Egypt. Israel, Jacob set out with all that was his, and he has a vision from God who tells him not to be afraid to go down to Egypt, for he will make you a great nation, and he will bring you back to the land of Canaan in the future. And so that's indeed what they did. They come and settle in Egypt. The famine was so severe that even the Egyptians ran out of money buying the food from the Pharaoh, that they ended up being in servitude to the Pharaoh, which changed the economics in Egypt a lot. Jacob, the father, lived 17 years in Egypt and died at 147. And with the help of Pharaoh and Joseph, they sent his body back to Hebron and had a grand, almost royal funeral to be buried with his ancestors, Abraham and Isaac. Joseph lived on and died at the age of 110, was buried in Egypt, and asked his brothers to promise that eventually his remains would go back also to be there in the land of Canaan. It is something how there's several things to learn here. First is that forgiveness is such a healing thing when one can find that resentment and anger, even though Joseph struggled with those things and we might say was real passive aggressive to his brothers back and forth, but he did want to protect them, and he wanted to save his father and his family. So Joseph also learned to forgive, but he also used what he had accomplished to protect and save his family. The other is that no matter how horrible things can be, and some of what happened to Joseph was about as bad as it could get, God was with him. God used him to save his people and to not only the Egyptians, but also his family from Canaan. And so it's good to remember is when we're in the midst of things, I don't think we always see clearly what God is doing, but sometimes when we look back, we can see even more clearly that God is with us always. The covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob extends now to his sons because Joseph helped save them during the time of famine. And so God's promises continue. And Joseph and his people know that and continue to tell that story. And that's why we have it even today, the history of God working with people, 3,500 years ago, and still today. God bless you. We'll see you next week.